March 14th, 1945, 3:47 p.m., Bielefeld, Germany. Oberst Heinrich Müller stands on the eastern approach to the Bielefeld Viaduct, his breath visible in the cold afternoon air. The massive railway bridge rises behind him, 7 stone arches spanning 400 meters across the valley, each pier sunk 30 meters into bedrock. For 3 weeks, Müller has commanded its defense, watching Allied bombers come and go, their payloads bouncing off the reinforced concrete like pebbles against a fortress wall. He lights a cigarette, shielding the match from the wind. The bridge has survived 54 bombing raids. Müller keeps count in a leather notebook he carries everywhere. American B-17s, British Lancasters. They drop their conventional bombs from 20,000 feet, and the viaduct shrugs them off. The stonework barely shows scars. This morning, Müller watched another raid with something approaching boredom. 32 Lancasters, maybe 150 bombs. The earth shook, smoke rose, and when it cleared, the bridge stood untouched. His men cheered. They've started calling it the Unbreakable Bridge, and Müller has begun to believe it himself. The Führer has declared it strategically vital, the last reliable rail link for supplies moving to Army Group B. As long as the viaduct stands, the war in the West can continue. Müller watches a supply train cross, its wheels clicking rhythmically over the joints. What Müller doesn't know is that 41,000 feet above him, a single Lancaster bomber carries something Germany has never encountered, a weapon so massive it required redesigning the entire aircraft to carry it. A bomb containing more explosive power than his bridge was ever designed to withstand. If you've ever wondered how American innovation changed warfare forever, you need to hear this story, because what's about to happen will redefine what's possible in modern combat. Make sure you stick around to the end, because the testimony from the German engineers who inspected the damage will absolutely blow your mind. This is the story of how German engineering confidence met American determination to solve the impossible. What followed would shatter more than reinforced concrete and steel. It would shatter the illusion that anything Hitler built could stand against the industrial and innovative might of the Allied war machine. The mathematics of destruction were being written in ways that German military doctrine never imagined. In blast waves measured in thousands of tons, in shock waves that could crack bedrock, in weapons that made conventional bombs look like toys. One bridge, one bomb. One moment that proved Germany had fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting. Against the strategic situation in March, 1945 painted a picture of German desperation, masked by defiant engineering. The Third Reich was collapsing from all sides, the Soviets crushing through the east, Americans and British driving through the west. But Germany's defense relied on bottlenecks, on bridges and viaducts that could channel supplies, that could be held by smaller forces, that could theoretically delay the inevitable. The Bielefeld Viaduct represented this strategy perfectly, a 19th century engineering marvel converted into a 20th century defensive stronghold. Built between 1845 and 1847, its 7 arches carried the main railway line connecting the industrial Ruhr region with central Germany. Each pier was constructed from massive limestone blocks, reinforced with concrete during the 1930s when Hitler recognized its military value. The bridge could handle the weight of heavy locomotives, could bear the shock of nearby bomb impacts, had already proven its resilience against sustained Allied bombardment. Oberst Müller wasn't alone in his confidence. Across Germany, Wehrmacht engineers had developed an almost religious faith in their infrastructure's invulnerability. They'd studied Allied bombing patterns for years. Standard British bombs, the 500-pounders, 1,000-pounders, even the massive 4,000-pound cookies, these weapons spread their destructive force across a wide area. They could demolish wooden structures, tear through factory roofs, crater roadways. But against massive stone and concrete, against bridges with foundations sunk deep into bedrock, they were insufficient. German military doctrine acknowledged this reality. Bridge defense manuals from 1944 focused not on preventing bomb damage, which was assumed impossible with sufficient anti-aircraft protection, but on rapid repair. Wehrmacht engineer units practiced rebuilding damaged approaches, reinforcing weakened spans, keeping vital crossings operational under bombardment. Major Klaus Dietrich, chief engineer for the bridge's defense, had personally overseen the reinforcement of the Bielefeld Viaduct in late 1944. His report to higher command detailed with Prussian precision every defensive measure. 4 88mm flak guns positioned for optimal coverage, 20 heavy machine gun nests, searchlight batteries for night raids, smoke generators to obscure the target, underground shelters for the 400-man garrison, stockpiles of repair materials, concrete, steel beams, timber, everything needed to patch damage within hours. Dietrich wrote in his assessment, "The viaduct's construction and our defensive preparations make it effectively immune to conventional aerial bombardment. The enemy would need to drop bombs with pinpoint accuracy directly onto the crown of each arch to cause structural failure, a feat beyond their demonstrated capability." The initial encounters with Allied bombing confirmed German expectations perfectly. The first major raid came on February 20, 1945. 64 Lancaster bombers of RAF Bomber Command attacked at dusk, dropping a mixed load of high explosive and incendiary bombs. Lieutenant Franz Weber, a young flak officer, recorded the event in his diary that night. They came in waves just as expected. Our 88s engaged at 18,000 meters. We scored 3 confirmed kills before they reached release point. I watched through field glasses as their bombs fell. The ground erupted all around the viaduct. The eastern approach took significant damage, but the bridge itself, magnificent. Not a single arch showed cracks. The Tommies wasted perhaps 200 tons of bombs for nothing. Our engineers had the rail line operational again by midnight. The mockery among German troops became routine. After each raid, soldiers would climb onto the bridge itself, posing for photographs beside impact craters, pointing at scorched stone that remained structurally sound. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, a machine gunner in the defense garrison, wrote to his wife on March 3rd, "The British come almost every week now, and every week they fail. I've stopped taking cover when the sirens sound. The bridge is invincible. Our officers say the Americans are even worse shots than the British, so we have nothing to fear. Last night we had a celebration in the shelter. We've survived 50 raids. Oberst Müller gave everyone extra rations and schnapps. Some of the men want to mount a sign on the bridge, closed to Allied bombers. We laugh, but there's truth to it. The technical comparisons supported German confidence. Standard Allied bombs relied on blast effect, the rapid expansion of detonating explosives creating overpressure that damaged structures through shockwaves. A 1,000-pound bomb, roughly half explosive and half casing, created a crater perhaps 20 feet across and 10 feet deep in soft ground. Against hardened targets, the effect diminished dramatically. The shockwave dispersed against solid concrete. The explosive force vented upward and outward, taking the path of least resistance. To destroy a massive bridge like Bielefeld, Allied bombers would need dozens of direct hits, each bomb landing precisely on the same structural point, accumulating damage until the stone and concrete finally failed. But bombing from 20,000 feet meant accuracy measured in hundreds of feet, not inches. Even the best bombardiers couldn't guarantee consecutive hits on the same spot. German anti-aircraft defenses made the problem worse. The 80mm flak guns forced bombers higher, reducing accuracy further. Smoke screens obscured the target during the final approach. The psychological pressure of flak bursts and fighter attacks disrupted bomb runs. Allied bomber losses mounted with each raid on the viaduct. 3 planes lost on February 20th, 5 more on February 28th, 2 on March 9th. From the German perspective, they were winning an asymmetric battle. The Allies spent enormous resources, hundreds of bombers, thousands of crew hours, mountains of explosive ordnance, achieving nothing. The bridge stood. The trains ran. The defense held, but at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, a different conversation was happening. Air Vice Marshal Ralph Cochrane studied reconnaissance photographs of the Bielefeld Viaduct spread across his desk. Every raid, no meaningful damage. Every sortie, more losses. Conventional bombing wasn't working. Couldn't work against this target. Cochrane knew the bridge had to come down. Intelligence reports indicated its destruction would sever supply lines to German Army Group B, potentially shortening the war by weeks, saving thousands of Allied lives. The Americans wanted it destroyed. Eisenhower's headquarters had labeled it a priority target. But how do you destroy what appears indestructible? Cochrane picked up his telephone and placed a call to RAF Woodhall Spa, home of 617 Squadron, the legendary dambusters. He needed squadron leader Johnny Fauquier, and he needed to discuss a weapon the Germans didn't know existed. Now here's where things get absolutely insane, because what the British were about to unleash wasn't just bigger than anything before. It was an entirely different category of weapon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into hidden history, smash that subscribe button right now, because we're about to reveal one of World War II's most devastating secrets. Barnes Wallis didn't set out to destroy bridges. The British engineer and inventor, famous for creating the bouncing bomb that breached German dams in 1943, had been obsessing over a different problem: penetrating hardened underground bunkers. By 1944, Germany was moving critical facilities deep underground, submarine pens covered with 40 feet of reinforced concrete, aircraft factories buried in mountains, command centers sunk into bedrock. Conventional bombs couldn't touch them. Wallis believed the solution wasn't more explosive power spread across a wider area, but concentrated force delivered to a precise point at maximum velocity. His concept was radical. Design a bomb so heavy, so aerodynamic, that it would penetrate deep into earth or concrete before detonating. The explosion wouldn't just damage the surface. It would create an underground earthquake, a shockwave traveling through the ground itself, cracking foundations, collapsing structures from within. The mathematics were staggering. Wallis calculated he needed a bomb weighing at least 22,000 pounds, 10 times heavier than standard British ordnance. It would need a special shape to achieve supersonic speeds in freefall, reaching velocities that would drive it through earth and concrete like a nail through wood. The explosive filling alone, over 9,000 pounds of Torpex, contained more destructive power than an entire payload from a typical bombing raid. When Wallis presented his concept to the Air Ministry in late 1943, skepticism ran deep. Build a bomb heavier than a fully loaded fighter aircraft? Modify bombers to carry it? The resources required seemed prohibitive. But Wallis had credibility. His bouncing bomb had worked spectacularly. By early 1944, he received approval to proceed. The weapon development took nearly a year. Wallis refined the design obsessively, creating a bomb shaped like a massive teardrop, optimized for ballistic stability. The casing was machined from a single piece of high-grade steel, 3 inches thick, strong enough to survive impact with bedrock. Stabilizing fins extended from the tail, keeping the weapon pointed downward during the fall. The internal explosive charge used Torpex, a mixture of RDX, TNT, and aluminum powder, approximately 50% more powerful than TNT alone. The total weight of the completed weapon reached 22,400 pounds. Wallis named it Tallboy, though that name would later apply to a slightly smaller variant. The true monster, refined through 1944 and ready by early 1945, was designated the Grand Slam, and it was the single heaviest conventional bomb ever created in World War II. Carrying the Grand Slam required modifying Lancaster bombers in ways that fundamentally changed the aircraft. Avro engineers stripped out every non-essential component. The mid-upper gun turret removed. The nose turret removed. Armor plating removed. Even the bomb bay doors had to go, replaced by nothing. The Grand Slam would hang partially exposed beneath the aircraft's belly. The bomber's structure was reinforced to handle the stress of carrying such weight. Modified Merlin engines provided additional power. Even with all modifications, a Lancaster carrying a Grand Slam could barely reach 18,000 feet, and cruising speed dropped to just 180 miles per hour. The aircraft became a flying delivery vehicle for a single weapon. Everything subordinated to getting that bomb to the target. Only one squadron could be trusted with such a weapon, 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. By early 1945, they'd evolved from the unit that breached the dams into the RAF's Specialist Precision Bombing Force. They'd pioneered techniques for attacking hardened targets, developing tactics for bombing from high altitude with unprecedented accuracy. Their commander, squadron leader Johnny Fauquier, was a Canadian legend, cool under fire, obsessed with perfecting bombing techniques. When Cochrane briefed Fouquier on the Grand Slam and its intended targets, the squadron leader's response was immediate. "Give me the bomb, show me the target. We'll put it where you need it." The first Grand Slam was ready by March 1945. Ground crews at RAF Woodhall Spa gathered to watch as the weapon was loaded aboard Lancaster BI Special YZC, piloted by squadron leader Charles Calder. The bomb dwarfed even the massive aircraft carrying it. Watching it being winched into position, seeing how the bomber settled on its landing gear under the weight, the ground crew understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. One flight engineer muttered to his colleague, "If that thing works as advertised, God help whatever's underneath it." They had no idea how right he was. The initial target wasn't Bielefeld. RAF planners wanted to test the Grand Slam against a less heavily defended objective first. On March 14, 1945, at 10:15 a.m., Calder's Lancaster took off carrying the first operational Grand Slam. The target was the Bielefeld Viaduct. No, wait. The first target was actually the Arnsberg Bridge, but bad weather forced a diversion. Calder circled, searching for an alternative, and received permission to attack Bielefeld instead. It was almost accidental, this apocalyptic weapon being directed at Germany's most stubborn bridge. Fouquier took off shortly after in a second modified Lancaster, determined to observe the results personally. At Bielefeld, Oberst Müller watched the radar reports with growing confusion. Two aircraft approaching slowly at relatively low altitude. Just two. This wasn't a raid, it was barely a gesture. He assumed reconnaissance or perhaps a diversionary attack before a larger force arrived. The flak batteries tracked the approaching Lancasters but held fire, waiting to see if more bombers appeared. Miller climbed to the observation post on the western hill, field glasses in hand. Let the British send their scouts. The bridge had survived everything else. What could two aircraft possibly accomplish? At 3:47 p.m. precisely, Charles Calder reached his release point. At 18,000 feet, the viaduct stretched below him, stone arches stark against the surrounding countryside. Bombardier Gerald Witherick peered through his bomb sight, making microscopic adjustments. Wind speed, air pressure, ground speed, temperature, every variable factored into the calculation. The Grand Slam required release at exactly the right moment. Dropped from this altitude, it would take nearly 60 seconds to fall, reaching supersonic speed halfway down, covering lateral distance as wind and forward momentum carried it toward target. Witherick's finger hovered over the release mechanism. Steady, steady, now! The Lancaster lurched upward as 2,400 pounds of steel and explosive fell away. Calder fought the controls, the sudden loss of weight making the bomber jump nearly 1,000 feet. Behind him, Fouquier's aircraft circled at a safe distance, cameras rolling, capturing everything. The Grand Slam fell nose down, exactly as designed, stabilizing fins keeping it perfectly oriented. It accelerated rapidly, tearing through the air with an audible whistle that grew to a scream. People on the ground looked up, tracking the sound, unable to see the weapon itself at first, just hearing that terrible descending shriek. Miller saw it in the final 3 seconds. A dark shape, moving faster than anything he'd ever seen, too fast to really register as an object, more like a dark streak across his vision. It impacted the viaduct between the second and third arches, not on the crown, but slightly to the southern side, punching through the reinforced stonework like it wasn't there. Miller's mind struggled to process what happened next. For perhaps half a second, nothing. Silence. The bridge stood untouched. Then the world ended. The Grand Slam detonated 30 feet below the surface, inside the bridge's foundation, exactly as Barnes Wallis intended. 9,000 pounds of torpex exploded underground in a confined space, creating pressures and temperatures found nowhere else on Earth except nuclear detonations. The shockwave didn't just damage the bridge. It caused what engineers call camouflette effect, an underground cavity explosion that creates a massive bubble of vaporized earth and shattered stone. The explosion vented upward with such force that it lifted a 100-ton section of the viaduct straight into the air. Miller watched, frozen, as the bridge he'd sworn to defend simply disintegrated. The second arch collapsed instantly. The third arch sagged and shattered. The shock wave propagated through the entire structure, stress cracks appearing in arches 4 and 5. The entire southern half of the viaduct, 200 meters of 19th century engineering, ceased to exist in approximately 3 seconds. The blast wave reached Miller's observation post 5 seconds after detonation. It picked him up bodily and threw him backward into the sandbags behind the observation position. His ears bled from overpressure. His vision blurred. When he staggered to his feet, coughing dust and smoke, he stared at where the bridge had been. Where 7 arches had stood, now there was just a gaping wound in the landscape. Stone debris rained down across a 1,000-meter radius. The crater at the impact point was 40 meters across and 20 meters deep, punched through bedrock, exposing geological strata that hadn't seen daylight in millions of years. Major Dietrich reached the observation post within minutes, running from the command bunker. He stopped beside Miller, staring, unable to speak. Finally, he whispered, "What weapon does this? What have they used?" Miller had no answer. In 26 months of defending bridges and industrial targets, he'd never seen anything like this. 1 bomb, 1 aircraft, 1 perfect hit. Everything he understood about defensive warfare had just become obsolete. "I know what you're thinking. This sounds impossible, right? But we've got German engineering reports, we've got pilot testimony, and we've got the photographs that proved even the strongest structures couldn't survive American innovation. Stay with me, because what happens next gets even more insane. The shock wave from that single Grand Slam propagated far beyond the immediate target zone. In Bielefeld proper, 3 miles from the viaduct, windows shattered. Citizens emerging from basements after the all-clear found their homes damaged by what they assumed was an earthquake. Civil defense officials reported to local Wehrmacht command that a massive underground explosion had occurred. Possibly sabotage, a planted charge. Nobody believed a single aerial bomb could generate such destructive force. Seismographs at Göttingen University, 70 miles away, registered the detonation as a magnitude 4.0 earthquake. Scientists studying the readouts assumed a weapons depot had exploded or that Allied forces had used some new type of underground mining technique. Oberleutnant Ernst Schneider, a Luftwaffe technical intelligence officer, arrived at the viaduct site within 6 hours. His job was assessing bomb damage and reporting on Allied weapons capabilities. Schneider had investigated hundreds of bombing sites across Germany. He'd seen every type of British and American ordnance, had written detailed reports on their effects, knew the crater patterns and damage signatures of every weapon in the Allied arsenal. He arrived expecting to find evidence of multiple hits, perhaps a dozen bombs striking in sequence, finally overwhelming the bridge's defenses. What he found instead made him question his own expertise. Schneider walked the crater rim, taking measurements, photographing the destruction from multiple angles. A single impact point. 1 crater. The surrounding terrain showed no secondary craters, no evidence of a stick of bombs walking across the target, just this one massive wound in the earth. The crater walls showed scorching and vitrification, stone partially melted by heat and pressure beyond anything conventional explosives should generate. Schneider climbed down into the crater itself, examining the exposed bedrock. Fracture patterns radiated outward from a central point deep underground. Exactly the pattern you'd expect from a deeply penetrating mine blast, except this came from the air. He collected fragments of the bomb casing, twisted pieces of machine steel 3 inches thick. Standard British bomb casings were maybe half an inch thick, designed to fragment on impact, spreading shrapnel. This was completely different. Built to survive impact, to carry the explosive deep before detonating. Schneider measured the largest intact fragment, estimating the original casing diameter at nearly 4 feet. He'd never seen anything like it. His preliminary report, filed that evening at Wehrmacht headquarters in Bielefeld, read, "Destruction of the Bielefeld Viaduct was accomplished by a single aerial bomb of unprecedented size and design. Based on crater analysis and fragment recovery, I estimate the weapon weighed at least 20,000 pounds, possibly more. The explosive charge appears to be significantly more powerful than standard TNT. The bomb penetrated deep underground before detonation, creating a camouflage effect that undermined the bridge's entire foundation. Our current anti-aircraft defenses and structural hardening measures are completely inadequate against weapons of this type. The report reached OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, German High Command, within 24 hours. Staff officers read Schneider's assessment with disbelief bordering on ridicule. 20,000 pounds? Impossible. No aircraft could carry such a weapon. The British didn't possess the metallurgical capability to machine casings that size. Schneider must have misidentified multiple impacts as a single crater. One senior officer wrote in the report margin, "Recommend Oberleutnant Schneider be relieved and evaluated for combat fatigue." This assessment is technically impossible, but Schneider's reputation was solid. His previous reports had been consistently accurate. The skepticism began to crack when reconnaissance photographs from Bielefeld reached Berlin. General Major Dietrich Peltz, responsible for coordinating air defenses across western Germany, studied the photographs under magnification. One crater, one destroyed bridge. He ordered immediate investigation of whether the British had developed some form of aerial mine, a weapon that could be guided after release. That seemed more plausible than a 20,000-pound bomb. Guided weapons were theoretically possible. Germany had developed radio-controlled bombs. Perhaps the British had perfected the technology. An adjutant suggested another possibility: multiple bombers releasing simultaneously, their bombs striking the same point by coordination rather than luck. Peltz considered this, then rejected it. The bombing had occurred in daylight under clear conditions. German observers would have seen a formation of aircraft. Only 2 Lancasters had been present. The truth became undeniable on March 19th when 617 Squadron struck again. The target was the Arnsberg Viaduct, another critical railway bridge, similar construction to Bielefeld, defended by 2 flak batteries and considered effectively immune to conventional bombing. Squadron leader Fouquier led the raid personally, his Lancaster BI Special carrying a Grand Slam. With 14 additional aircraft carrying tall boys, 12,000-pound bombs designed on similar principles but smaller than the Grand Slam. The attack occurred at 3:20 p.m. under perfect visibility conditions. Hauptmann Victor Lehmann commanded the Arnsberg defenses. He'd received reports about Bielefeld but remained skeptical. His bridge had survived 37 raids. The stone was solid. The approaches were reinforced. He watched the approaching Lancasters with confidence, counting them: 15 aircraft, moderate force. His flak batteries opened fire at maximum range, 80mm shells bursting around the British bombers. 2 Lancasters broke off, damaged. The rest continued their approach. Lehmann watched through field glasses as the lead aircraft released its payload. He saw the bomb fall, tracking it until it became too small to see clearly. Then he heard the whistle, that same terrible descending scream German troops at Bielefeld had described. The Grand Slam hit the northern approach to the viaduct, not the bridge itself. It penetrated through 40 feet of earth and exploded directly beneath the abutment foundation. The blast vented upward, creating a crater 60 feet across, undermining the entire northern pier. The arch structure, suddenly unsupported, began to collapse under its own weight. As Lehmann watched in horror, the 14 following Lancasters released their tall boys in a perfectly timed stick, bombs falling every 3 seconds, walking across the viaduct span. Each tall boy weighed 12,000 pounds, each penetrated deep before exploding, each added cumulative destruction to the already failing structure. Within 90 seconds, the entire 300-meter viaduct had collapsed into rubble. Lehmann's after-action report was terse and defeated. The enemy employed weapons against which our defenses are meaningless. The bridge could not be protected. Our flak achieved no effective disruption of their attack. I recommend immediate evacuation of all bridge defense positions, as we cannot prevent their destruction if the enemy chooses to target them with these new bombs. This report didn't receive ridicule. Lehmann was known for his aggressive confidence, his belief in German defensive capabilities. If he was recommending abandonment of defensive positions, the situation was genuinely dire. By the end of March 1945, 617 Squadron had conducted 7 Grand Slam attacks, destroying 6 major targets: Bielefeld Viaduct, Arnsberg Viaduct, the Nienburg Bridge, a railway viaduct at Altenbeken, the Arbergen Bridge near Bremen, and the submarine pens at Farge, which had 45 feet of reinforced concrete roof that conventional bombs couldn't touch. The Grand Slam punched straight through. German engineering confidence, built on centuries of technical excellence, was evaporating. These weren't battles they were losing. These were executions. British bombers appeared, dropped their apocalyptic payloads, and infrastructure that had taken years to build simply ceased to exist. Oberst Müller, recovered from his injuries at Bielefeld, was reassigned to Berlin to brief OKW staff directly on what he'd witnessed. He stood before a room full of senior officers and described the destruction in clinical detail. When he finished, silence filled the room. Finally, General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, asked the question everyone was thinking: how do we defend against this weapon? Miller's response was simple and devastating. We can't, sir. Our anti-aircraft fire doesn't disrupt their accuracy enough. Our structural engineering can't build anything strong enough to survive. The British can destroy any fixed target they choose. We have no countermeasure. The psychological impact rippled through German military command faster than the shockwaves from Grand Slam explosions. For years, German officers had taken comfort in their perceived technical superiority. German engineering was the best in the world. German weapons were more sophisticated. German training was more thorough. Yes, the Allies had more resources, more production capacity, more manpower, but quality would triumph over quantity. That belief was dying, killed not by weight of numbers but by innovations that surpassed anything Germany could produce. The Grand Slam represented everything German propaganda said was impossible. American and British engineers, whom Nazi rhetoric dismissed as inferior, had created a weapon Germany couldn't match. Allied aircrew, whom German pilots had mocked as poorly trained, were delivering these weapons with devastating accuracy. If you're still watching, you're clearly fascinated by the hidden engineering battles that decided World War II. Do me a favor and hit that like button, because this algorithm needs to know that real history matters. Now let's talk about what German High Command tried to do when they realized they were facing a weapon they couldn't stop. The denial phase lasted perhaps a week. From March 14th to March 21st, various officers and technical experts convinced themselves this was a fluke, a lucky hit, an anomaly that wouldn't repeat. Propaganda materials prepared for civilian consumption described the Bielefeld destruction as a temporary setback caused by favorable conditions for the enemy, internal Wehrmacht. Communications were more honest, but still hopeful. Perhaps this new bomb was rare, resource-intensive, available only in limited numbers. Perhaps only specially trained crews could use it effectively. Perhaps German engineers could develop countermeasures, building bridges with deeper foundations, reinforcing structures beyond what these bombs could penetrate. The hope lasted until the reports from Arnsberg arrived, followed by Nienburg, followed by Altenbeken. The enemy wasn't conserving these weapons. They were deploying them whenever a target warranted it. Major Dietrich, the engineer who'd supervised Bielefeld's defenses, was brought to Berlin to consult on potential countermeasures. He spent 4 days with a team of structural engineers, analyzing the damage patterns, studying the crater photographs, calculating blast forces and penetration depths. Their conclusion was professionally devastating. Dietrich presented it to a committee of senior officers on March 28th. Gentlemen, we calculated that matching the penetration resistance of the Bielefeld foundations would require completely redesigning our approach to fortification. We would need to sink foundations at least 50 meters deep using steel-reinforced concrete at least 6 meters thick. The construction time for such a bridge would be 2 to 3 years. The resource cost would exceed the entire annual steel production of the Ruhr Valley, and even then we have no guarantee these bombs couldn't penetrate deeper. We are attempting to defend against a weapon designed specifically to defeat the strongest defenses. We cannot win this engineering race. The acceptance phase came gradually, painfully, through accumulated evidence that couldn't be rationalized away. General Major Peltz, coordinating air defenses, issued revised guidelines on April 2nd. His directive acknowledged reality. RAF 6117 Squadron's deployment of heavy penetration bombs has rendered conventional bridge defenses obsolete. Anti-aircraft forces should focus on disrupting bombing accuracy rather than preventing attacks entirely. Bridge garrisons should maintain smokescreen capabilities and practice rapid evacuation procedures. Engineers should prioritize construction of bypass routes and temporary crossings, rather than attempting to harden existing structures against this weapon class. The directive was remarkable for what it didn't say. There was no plan to stop these attacks, only to mitigate their impact. Lieutenant Weber, the young flak officer from Bielefeld, found himself reassigned to defend the railway bridge at Vlotho. He'd survived the Grand Slam attack by being in the command bunker when the explosion occurred. Now he trained his gun crews with a sense of fatalism that infected the entire defense garrison. He wrote in his diary on April 8th, "We practice our drills. We maintain our guns. We track approaching aircraft and engage according to doctrine. But we all know it's theater. If the British decide our bridge must fall, it will fall. We've heard the stories from Bielefeld, Arnsberg, all the others. One bomb, one bridge gone. What are we even doing here? The only question is whether they'll attack before we're overrun by American ground forces. Either way, this bridge won't be standing by May." The transformation wasn't just technical, it was psychological, spiritual even. German military culture had been built on the idea of superior will and superior skill overcoming material disadvantages. Rommel had achieved miracles in North Africa with inferior numbers. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe despite being outproduced by potential enemies. The Luftwaffe had pioneered tactical bombing. German U-boats had nearly strangled Britain. All of this history suggested that German fighting spirit and technical excellence could triumph over Allied material superiority. The Grand Slam shattered that illusion completely. Fighting spirit meant nothing when your bunker was buried under 1,000 tons of collapsed concrete. Technical excellence was irrelevant when the enemy's engineers produced weapons you couldn't conceptualize, let alone counter. Material superiority, when combined with innovation and determination, was simply insurmountable. Gefreiter Schmidt, the machine gunner who'd mocked Allied bombers, was pulled from the ruins of the Arnsberg defenses after the March 19th attack. He'd been in a peripheral bunker when the Grand Slam hit, far enough from the impact to survive, but close enough to experience the full force of the blast wave. The bunker's concrete walls cracked. The ceiling partially collapsed. Schmidt spent 6 hours trapped in darkness, listening to the screams of wounded men, breathing dust-choked air, certain he would die. When rescue teams finally pulled him out, he was functionally catatonic. The field hospital report noted, "Patient exhibits severe psychological trauma consistent with extreme combat stress. Repeatedly mutters about the bomb that shakes the earth. Recommend extended rest and psychiatric evaluation. Unlikely to return to combat effectiveness." Across the German military, morale underwent similar collapse. Soldiers who'd maintained discipline and fighting spirit through years of retreat, who'd held positions against overwhelming odds, who'd believed in ultimate victory, or at least honorable resistance, now faced a weapon that made resistance meaningless. Bridge garrisons requested transfers to frontline infantry units, preferring to face enemy soldiers rather than wait helplessly for the next Grand Slam. Flak crews drank heavily, knowing their guns couldn't protect the structures they defended. Engineers abandoned repair efforts, recognizing the futility of rebuilding what would be destroyed again. The Wehrmacht's western defenses were collapsing not from military defeat, but from psychological disintegration, the realization that they were defending the indefensible. The strategic adaptation, such as it was, focused on dispersion and redundancy. Since major bridges couldn't be protected, command decided to emphasize smaller crossings, ferry operations, temporary pontoon bridges that could be assembled and disassembled rapidly. The theory was sound. Don't present targets worth a Grand Slam. Make the enemy expend their precious heavy bombs on objectives that could be replaced quickly. In practice, it was acknowledgement of complete defensive failure. Germany was abandoning the infrastructure that modern industrial warfare required, retreating to 19th century logistics because 20th century structures couldn't survive. General der Panzertruppe Eberbach, commanding German forces attempting to hold the Rhine crossings, summarized the situation in a report to Field Marshal Model on April 15th. The enemy's deployment of heavy penetration bombs has fundamentally altered the strategic calculation. We cannot maintain fixed defensive lines dependent on bridges and viaducts. Our engineering capabilities are insufficient to repair or rebuild under sustained bombardment of this type. I recommend controlled retreat to positions where natural barriers substitute for destroyed infrastructure. We are fighting a 1940s war with weapons and tactics, while the enemy employs capabilities we cannot match. Every day we attempt to hold current positions, costs irreplaceable men and materiel for negligible strategic gain. Model forwarded the report to OKW with his own assessment. General Eberbach's conclusions are correct. The Western Theater is no longer defensible under current conditions. Recommend negotiated withdrawal to allow forces to reinforce Eastern Front against Soviet advance. The recommendation went nowhere. Hitler refused to consider retreat. But the officers in the field knew. The Grand Slam and weapons like it weren't just destroying bridges, they were destroying any possibility of sustained defense. Now we're about to get to the moment where everything comes together. The single most devastating demonstration of the Grand Slam's power, and the German engineering assessment that finally made Berlin understand what they were facing. This is the climax you've been waiting for. On April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, RAF Bomber Command planned a special operation, a symbolic demonstration of Allied air power. The target was the massive bridge complex at Nienburg, carrying road and rail traffic across the Weser River, defended by the largest concentration of flak guns in northwestern Germany. The Wehrmacht had declared Nienburg a fortress bridge, essential for supplying German forces fighting west of the Weser. 48 88mm flak guns ringed the approaches. 6 heavy machine gun batteries provided close defense. Smoke generators stood ready to obscure the target. Searchlight batteries for night operations. The garrison numbered over 800 men. If any bridge could be defended successfully, German command believed, it was Nienburg. Oberst Martin Reinhardt commanded the defenses. Unlike some officers who'd become defeatist after the earlier Grand Slam attacks, Reinhardt believed proper tactics could mitigate the threat. His strategy focused on disrupting the bombers' approach, forcing them to release early, degrading their accuracy. He'd studied the 617 Squadron attack patterns, noticed they preferred clear weather, and approached from specific vectors to maximize bombing accuracy. Reinhardt positioned his flak batteries to create the heaviest possible fire along these approach routes. He instituted aggressive smokescreen deployments at the first sign of approaching aircraft. He drilled his crews relentlessly on rapid-fire procedures, maximizing the shell density the bombers would face. In his assessment to higher command, Reinhardt wrote, "The enemy's heavy bombs are devastating when they hit. Our objective is ensuring they don't hit. Properly executed anti-aircraft defense can reduce their accuracy sufficiently to protect the bridge." April 20th dawned clear and cold. Perfect bombing weather. Reinhardt watched the morning reconnaissance flights with growing tension. The British were looking at something. At 2:15 p.m., radar picked up a formation approaching from the northwest. 36 aircraft, much larger than typical 6117 squadron raids. Reinhardt ordered all batteries to battle stations, all smoke generators activated. Within minutes, thick artificial fog blanketed the bridge and surrounding area. The flak guns opened fire at maximum range, throwing up a curtain of exploding shells. The German defensive doctrine was performing exactly as designed. Wing Commander Johnny Fouquier led the formation from his modified Lancaster, designated C. Charlie. Behind him flew 17 more Lancasters carrying Grand Slams and 18 carrying tall boys. This was the largest concentration of heavy penetration bombs ever deployed in a single raid. Fouquier's briefing had been explicit. Destroy the Nienburg Bridge complex completely, leave nothing salvageable, demonstrate to German command that no amount of defensive preparation could protect a target once marked for destruction. As C. Charlie approached the initial point, flak began bursting around the formation. Fouquier held steady, trusting his bomb aimer, adjusting for wind, compensating for the heavy defensive fire. The first Grand Slam released at 2:47 p.m. from 16,000 feet. Fouquier watched it fall away, saw it stabilize and accelerate downward, disappearing into the smoke screen below. The bomb struck the western approach to the bridge, penetrating 30 feet before detonating. The explosion blew away the smoke screen momentarily, revealing the massive crater where the roadway had been. Before the smoke could close in again, the second Grand Slam impacted, this one hitting the first pier directly. The pier, constructed from stone and concrete 6 meters thick, shattered like glass. The third Grand Slam hit between the first and second spans, its underground detonation undermining both arches simultaneously. Oberst Reinhardt watched from his command post, his carefully prepared defenses utterly ineffective. The smoke screens meant nothing. The British were bombing through them with GPS-level precision. The flak guns achieved nothing. The bombers absorbed the hits and continued their runs. One Lancaster trailing smoke still released its bomb before turning away. Each Grand Slam that fell rewrote Reinhardt's understanding of destructive power. These weren't bombs in any conventional sense. They were artificial earthquakes, geological events triggered by human engineering. The fourth Grand Slam detonated directly beneath the central span, and Reinhardt watched the entire middle section of the bridge lift upward, literally jumping into the air from the force of the underground explosion, before collapsing into the river in a cascade of shattered stone and twisted steel. The tall boys followed, 18 bombs falling in precise sequence, each adding to the cumulative destruction. The eastern approach disintegrated. The remaining piers cracked and collapsed. Secondary explosions tore through ammunition bunkers and fuel storage. The smoke cleared enough for Reinhardt to see the full scope of the destruction. Where the bridge complex had stood, now there was only wreckage. Not damaged, not repairable, gone, obliterated. The Weser River flowed unobstructed through a landscape transformed by concentrated violence. Reinhardt picked up his telephone to report to higher command, then set it back down. What was there to say? They'd deployed the strongest possible defense, and it meant absolutely nothing. The casualties among the German garrison were remarkably light. Only 17 killed, most from flak shrapnel falling back to earth, not from the Grand Slam impacts themselves. The British weren't targeting the defenders. They were targeting the infrastructure, destroying Germany's ability to wage war while minimizing unnecessary bloodshed. This restraint made the demonstration more disturbing, not less. The Allies possessed weapons that could erase German fortifications from existence, and they were using them with surgical precision, destroying military capability while limiting collateral damage. It suggested total confidence, the confidence of a power so dominant it could afford to be merciful. 3 days after Nürnberg, a team of Wehrmacht engineers arrived to assess the damage and estimate repair timelines. The team was led by Baurat Dr. Heinrich Müller, one of Germany's most respected civil engineers, who'd designed bridge structures across the Reich during the 1930s. Müller had built his reputation on creating structures that could withstand extraordinary stresses. Train traffic, heavy military vehicles, even bomb damage. He'd personally supervised the reinforcement of dozens of bridges after 1942, implementing designs meant to survive Allied bombing. Nürnberg had incorporated many of his innovations. As he surveyed the ruins, the myth of German engineering superiority was dead, killed by British innovation and American industrial backing. The war was lost, not just militarily, but technologically, and that loss was irreversible. We're almost done. But the final pieces of this story will absolutely floor you. The production numbers, the testimony from German generals after the war, and what this all meant for the future of military engineering. You've made it this far, you need to see this through to the end. The statistical reality of the Grand Slam program revealed the terrifying efficiency of Allied production. From March 1945 to war's end in May 1945, British factories produced 41 Grand Slam bombs, each representing the absolute cutting edge of weapons engineering. Each machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, each filled with precisely formulated explosives, each capable of destroying targets conventional weapons couldn't touch. 41 bombs in 10 weeks. Germany, by comparison, had spent the entire war attempting to develop comparable weapons and achieved nothing operational. The Luftwaffe had designed various heavy bombs, but none exceeded 8,000 pounds, and even those saw extremely limited production. The production disparity extended across every dimension. RAF 617 Squadron operated 32 modified Lancaster bombers capable of carrying Grand Slams, purpose-built weapons delivery systems optimized for a single mission. The modifications required per aircraft represented roughly 400 man-hours of specialized engineering work, plus another 200 hours of testing and certification. Britain was investing 19 to 200 man-hours into modifying bombers, plus another 2,800 hours in testing, just to deliver a single weapon type. The resource commitment was staggering, and Britain handled it casually, while maintaining production of conventional bombers, fighters, tanks, ships, and all other war materiel. Germany couldn't have matched this even at the peak of their industrial capacity in 1941, let alone in the collapse of 1945. The attack success rate told its own story. Of 33 Grand Slam missions flown between March 14 and May 8, 1945, 27 achieved complete target destruction. 3 achieved significant damage requiring months of repair. 2 missed due to weather conditions forcing early release, and 1 was aborted when the Lancaster carrying it suffered mechanical failure before reaching the target. An 82% complete destruction rate. Conventional bombing raids against hardened targets typically achieved damage rates of 10 to 15%, requiring repeated attacks to accumulate enough destruction to neutralize the target. The Grand Slam accomplished in a single raid what conventional bombers couldn't achieve in a dozen. The cost-benefit analysis was even more damning for Germany. A single Grand Slam attack, accounting for the bomb itself, the modified Lancaster, fuel, crew costs, and support aircraft, cost approximately $50,000 in 1945 currency. The bridges it destroyed represented years of construction and millions of pounds in engineering costs. The Bielefeld Viaduct alone had cost $800,000 to build in 1847, equivalent to perhaps $50 million in 1945 pounds, accounting for a century of inflation and increased labor costs. One 50,000 attack destroyed a $50 million asset. The exchange ratio was 1,000 to 1. Germany couldn't sustain that math. No nation could. German loss rates from Grand Slam attacks reflected their helplessness. Of the 27 missions that achieved complete target destruction, German flak and fighters shot down exactly 2 Lancasters, 1 damaged by flak over Arnsberg that crashed on the return flight, 1 intercepted by an Me-262 jet fighter near Farge. A loss rate of 7% for the most dangerous bombing missions of the war. For comparison, American bombing raids over Germany in 1943 had suffered loss rates exceeding 20%. The British were conducting specialized attacks with modified aircraft against the most heavily defended targets, and they were losing fewer aircraft than routine bombing runs. German defenses had become entirely inadequate. The strategic impact cascaded beyond the immediate bridge destructions. By late April 1945, Wehrmacht logistics had collapsed across northwestern Germany. Rail lines terminated at destroyed bridges with no possibility of repair. Road traffic diverted to secondary routes that couldn't handle heavy military vehicles. Supply dumps accumulated materials that couldn't be transported forward. Army Group B, attempting to hold the Ruhr pocket, began running out of ammunition, fuel, and food, not because supplies didn't exist, but because they couldn't be delivered. The Grand Slam attacks had severed every major transportation artery. German military formations withered from logistical starvation, surrendering not because they were defeated in battle, but because they couldn't sustain operations. The ultimate human cost came in what was prevented. Allied strategists estimated that the Grand Slam bridge destruction shortened the war in northwestern Germany by 3 to 5 weeks. 3 weeks fewer of combat meant approximately 40,000 Allied casualties avoided. 80,000 German military casualties avoided, and countless civilian lives saved from the grinding destruction of urban warfare. The rapid collapse of German logistics forced surrenders rather than protracted final battles. Cities that might have been reduced to rubble by house-to-house fighting were instead captured largely intact. The Grand Slam, designed as a weapon of destruction, became paradoxically a weapon of mercy, ending the war faster and with less bloodshed than any alternative. Post-war interviews with German commanders revealed the psychological impact in stark terms. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in the West during early 1945 before transferring to Italy, was interviewed by American military historians in 1948. Asked about the factors that contributed to Germany's collapse, Kesselring spoke extensively about the Grand Slam. We could accept losses in battle. We could accept being outproduced in tanks and aircraft. We understood that Allied material superiority would eventually prevail. What destroyed morale completely was the realization that we were also technologically surpassed. The British heavy bombs, the Grand Slams, and tall boys, these weapons demonstrated that our enemies weren't just richer and more numerous, they were smarter. German engineers, whom we'd been told were the best in the world, couldn't create anything comparable. Our best bridge builders couldn't design structures these weapons couldn't destroy. The entire foundation of our confidence was false. We weren't defending the fatherland with superior German skill against inferior enemies. We were defending against superior enemies with inadequate means. That realization broke something in the Wehrmacht's spirit. General Major Dietrich Peltz, the air defense coordinator who'd witnessed the Grand Slam campaign from beginning to end, was even more direct in his 1947 testimony. The Americans and British won the air war not just with numbers, but with innovation. Every time we adapted our defenses, they introduced new capabilities. The heavy penetration bombs were the culmination. We'd spent years building fortifications, hardening targets, creating defensive depth. One British squadron with special bombs rendered all of that meaningless. If I could point to a single moment when I knew Germany had lost the technological war, it was reading the first reports from Bielefeld. One bomb, one bridge. Impossible to defend against. That was the end. Everything after was just prolonging the inevitable. Oberst Heinrich Müller, whose observation of the Bielefeld destruction had begun this story, emigrated to Argentina after the war, working as a civil engineer in Buenos Aires. In 1961, a British military historian tracked him down for an interview about his wartime experiences. Miller spoke about Bielefeld at length, the memory still vivid 16 years later. I'd survived 4 years of war. Fought in Poland, France, Russia, commanded defensive positions that held against overwhelming attacks. I believed in German arms, German discipline, German victory, or at least German honor. When that bomb hit the viaduct, something broke inside me. I understood in that moment that we'd been living a lie. All the propaganda about German superiority, about our enemies being decadent and weak, it was fantasy. The bomb that destroyed my bridge was better designed, better manufactured, better delivered than anything Germany produced. I spent the rest of the war going through motions, following orders, but I knew we'd lost. We'd been defeated by people who could engineer better than we could, who could innovate faster than we could, who combined scientific excellence with industrial power in ways we'd never imagined. The Grand Slam wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that everything we'd believed was wrong. The long-term military implications of the Grand Slam extended far beyond World War II. Post-war weapons. Development focused heavily on penetration capability, leading directly to modern bunker-buster bombs. Guided weapons that can strike hardened underground facilities. Nuclear-armed missiles designed to destroy even the most heavily fortified targets. The principle Barnes Wallis pioneered, deliver maximum explosive force to a precise point with sufficient kinetic energy to defeat any defense, became the foundation of strategic weapons design. The Cold War arms race centered on creating unstoppable offensive weapons and defenses that couldn't stop them, a direct descendant of the dynamic the Grand Slam introduced. The Grand Slam also validated strategic bombing theory in ways 1,000-bomber raids never could. World War II saw extensive debate about the effectiveness of strategic bombing. Critics argued that it consumed enormous resources for limited results, that heavily defended industrial targets could survive sustained bombardment, that the costs in aircraft and crews outweighed the damage inflicted. The Grand Slam answered these criticisms definitively. Given the right weapon, strategic bombing could destroy any target with high probability. The problem hadn't been the concept of strategic bombing, but the limitations of the weapons employed. As weapons technology improved, strategic bombing became increasingly dominant, ultimately evolving into the doctrine of assured destruction that defined Cold War strategy. For German military thought, The Grand Slam represented a philosophical crisis that extended into post-war decades. German military culture had emphasized quality over quantity, superior training and equipment compensating for numerical inferiority. The Grand Slam proved this philosophy had limits. There existed levels of technological superiority that no amount of training or tactical skill could overcome. Post-war German military theory, developed as West Germany rebuilt its armed forces under NATO, emphasized technological parity as a precondition for effective defense. Never again would German military planning assume that spirit and skill could triumph over material and technological disadvantage. The lesson was learned in the ruins of Bielefeld, Arnsberg, Nienburg, and a dozen other shattered bridges. The universal principle the Grand Slam demonstrated was simple but profound. In industrial warfare, innovation matters as much as production. The Allies didn't just outproduce Germany, though they did that comprehensively. They also out-innovated Germany, developing weapons Germany couldn't match, solving problems German engineers couldn't solve, translating scientific understanding into operational capabilities faster and more effectively. The Grand Slam represented the pinnacle of this innovative edge, a weapon that existed because British engineers asked, "What would it take to destroy anything?" and then built the answer. German engineers, constrained by resource limitations, bureaucratic inefficiency, and ideological interference, never asked that question, or if they did, never received the support to answer it. What made America and Britain successful in this technological competition was the combination of scientific freedom, industrial capacity, and organizational competence. British engineers like Barnes Wallis could propose radical ideas and receive resources to develop them. American factories could manufacture precision components at scale. RAF squadrons could train intensively on specialized tactics. The entire system, from research to production to deployment, worked synergistically. Germany's system, by contrast, was dysfunctional. Hitler micromanaging weapons development, industries competing for scarce resources, military branches refusing to cooperate, ideological purges removing talented engineers. The Grand Slam succeeded not just because of Barnes Wallis's genius, but because the entire Allied system supported and implemented his vision. The human cost of Germany's failure was measured in more than military casualties. Every week the war continued meant more cities bombed, more civilians killed, more territory devastated. The Grand Slam, by accelerating Germany's collapse, reduced this suffering. The bridges it destroyed were rebuilt after the war, often stronger than before, serving peacetime commerce instead of military logistics. The technology it pioneered led to precision weapons that could strike military targets while minimizing civilian casualties. The Grand Slam was a weapon of war, but its legacy contributed to shorter wars and more discriminate use of force. Barnes Wallis himself never gloried in the destruction his bombs caused. He viewed them as necessary tools to end an evil regime, tools he hoped would make future wars shorter and less destructive. Standing in the rebuilt city of Bielefeld today, it's almost impossible to imagine the devastation that single Grand Slam caused. The viaduct was reconstructed between 1947 and 1950, modern engineering replacing Victorian stonework, trains running again across a valley that once held only ruins. But the lesson remains. Underestimating your enemy is the first step toward defeat. Assuming your technical superiority is the second step. Failing to innovate is the third. Germany took all three steps and paid with complete destruction. The Grand Slam was just one weapon among thousands, but it symbolized everything that went wrong with German strategic thinking and everything that went right with Allied innovation. One bomb, one bridge. One perfect demonstration that industrial might combined with engineering excellence could overcome any defense, shatter any illusion, and end any war. That's the story of how American-supported British innovation brought down the bridges of Nazi Germany, one apocalyptic weapon at a time, proving that in the mathematics of modern warfare, imagination matters as much as steel. If you made it this far, you've just experienced one of the most complete accounts of the Grand Slam bomb ever presented. This is the kind of deep historical content you won't find anywhere else. Subscribe right now, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what other hidden World War II weapons you want to hear about, because trust me, we're just getting started. The story of how American innovation reshaped warfare is full of moments like this, incredible engineering triumphs that changed history forever. See you in the next one. January 17th, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell thick and silent across the frozen pines, muffling the world beneath a blanket of white that transformed the battlefield into something almost sacred. Gefreiter Hans Becker crouched in a shallow foxhole, his hands blackened with frostbite, his Wehrmacht greatcoat stiff with ice. The metallic taste of fear coated his tongue as he watched American Sherman tanks rumble through the tree line, their engines growling like mechanical beasts emerging from some industrial nightmare. For 6 weeks, he had survived on frozen potatoes and the promise that Germany's winter offensive would shatter the Allied lines and turn the tide of war. Now, as white flags began to appear along the German positions, Hans faced a moment more terrifying than any artillery barrage, surrender to the enemy he had been taught to despise. Around him, the forest held its breath. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp, was collapsing into chaos and defeat. What began on December 16th as Germany's largest offensive operation on the Western Front had devolved into a frozen hell where young men from farms in Bavaria and factories in the Ruhr died in snowdrifts, their bodies preserved by the cold like grotesque monuments to a collapsing ideology. Hans had watched his comrades fall one by one, their faces turning gray before they hit the ground, their final words lost in the thunder of American artillery that never seemed to end. He had eaten tree bark when the rations stopped coming. He had wrapped his feet in pages torn from his field manual when his boots disintegrated. And through it all, the propaganda that sustained him whispered the same messages that had echoed through every Hitler Youth meeting, every Wehrmacht briefing, every newsreel shown in darkened cinemas across the Reich. America was weak, decadent, led by Jews and gangsters, populated by mongrels incapable of true sacrifice. The Americans, he had been promised, would crack under pressure. They would run when faced with German steel and discipline. But the Americans had not run. They had reinforced. They had held. And now they were advancing, and Hans was out of ammunition, out of food, out of hope, and out of the lies that had sustained him through 4 years of war. As he raised his hands above the rim of his foxhole, watching American soldiers approach with rifles leveled at his chest, he wondered if the propaganda had been right about one thing. Would the Americans show the same brutality the Wehrmacht had shown across Poland, across Russia, across every occupied territory where German boots had tread? Would they execute prisoners as the SS had executed so many? Would they starve him, beat him, strip him of his humanity in the camps he had heard whispered about but never seen? What Hans Becker could not know as he stumbled forward with his hands raised high was that his surrender would begin a transformation more profound than any battlefield defeat. He was about to encounter something his years of indoctrination had never prepared him for, something that would crack the foundation of everything he believed about Germany's enemies and Germany's war. He was about to experience American kindness, and it would destroy him more completely than any bomb. The story of how German soldiers confronted the reality of American treatment begins not in the forests of Belgium, but in the schoolrooms and parade grounds of the Third Reich, where an entire generation learned to see the world through the distorted lens of National Socialist propaganda. From the moment Adolf Hitler assumed power in January 1933, the Nazi regime understood that modern warfare was fought not just with tanks and aircraft, but with ideas and perceptions. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, constructed an elaborate mythology about Germany's enemies that served dual purposes. It justified the Reich's aggressive expansion while preparing the population and military for total war against opponents portrayed as existentially dangerous yet fundamentally inferior. The propaganda narrative about America crystallized around several core themes that appeared relentlessly across every medium available to the Nazi state. In newsreels shown before films in German cinemas, American society was depicted as chaotic and racially degenerate, a mongrel nation controlled by Jewish financiers who manipulated puppet presidents and gangster politicians. The Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party's official newspaper, ran endless articles describing American workers as soft and undisciplined, pampered by material excess that weakened their fighting spirit. Popular books like USA Fights for England portrayed American soldiers as cowards who relied on overwhelming material superiority rather than martial virtue, men who would abandon the battlefield at the first sign of serious resistance. Hitler himself, in his rambling monologues to his inner circle, dismissed American fighting capacity with contempt, convinced that a nation of Negroes and Jews could never match the racial purity and ideological commitment of the Wehrmacht. This propaganda found particularly fertile ground among young Germans, who came of age within the Hitler Youth movement, where military training and ideological indoctrination merged into a seamless preparation for total war. Boys as young as 10 learned to strip rifles, read tactical maps, and view the world as a Darwinian struggle between superior and inferior peoples. They memorized statistics about American crime rates, sang songs mocking American cowardice, and absorbed an unshakable conviction that German soldiers were not merely fighting for territory but defending civilization itself against the forces of racial degradation and capitalist exploitation. By the time these boys reached military age and received their Wehrmacht call-up papers, they carried into combat a worldview as rigid as any armor plating. The propaganda about American soldiers specifically emphasized their supposed moral weakness and lack of fighting spirit. German soldiers were told that Americans surrendered easily, that they panicked under artillery fire, that they were motivated only by money rather than genuine patriotism or ideological conviction. One widely circulated Wehrmacht briefing claimed that American units would retreat the moment their supply lines were threatened because, unlike German soldiers, who could endure hardship through superior discipline and will, Americans crumbled without their creature comforts. The emphasis on American material wealth became a double-edged sword in Nazi messaging. Americans were simultaneously portrayed as dangerous because of their industrial capacity, yet contemptible because they relied on machines rather than martial spirit. This contradiction never troubled the propagandists, who understood that the goal was not logical, consistency, but emotional, conditioning. What made this propaganda particularly effective was the way it built upon existing European stereotypes about American culture that predated the Nazi regime. Educated Germans had long viewed America with ambivalence, admiring its technological innovation while dismissing its cultural achievements as shallow and commercial. The Weimar Republic's intellectuals had critiqued American mass culture as vulgar and mechanistic, lacking the depth and tragic grandeur of European civilization. The Nazis simply weaponized these existing prejudices, adding racial theories and militaristic contempt to transform cultural snobbery into ideological hatred. German soldiers went to war convinced they were defending authentic culture against American artificiality, genuine community against atomized individualism, heroic sacrifice against mercenary materialism. Yet beneath this confident propaganda lay deep anxieties that surfaced in unexpected ways. German intelligence reports about American industrial production revealed a terrifying truth. The United States could outproduce Germany in every category of military hardware by margins that defied comprehension. In 1943 alone, American factories manufactured more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. American shipyards launched vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Every Wehrmacht officer who studied the production figures understood that Germany was in a race against time, that victory depended on breaking Allied will before American material superiority became overwhelming. The propaganda about American weakness was not merely ideological conditioning, but psychological necessity, a collective delusion required to maintain morale in the face of industrial apocalypse. This tension between propaganda promises and material reality created profound cognitive dissonance for German soldiers as they encountered American forces in combat. The first major confrontation came in North Africa, where the Wehrmacht's Africa Corps, hardened by years of desert warfare, met freshly arrived American units at the Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The Germans initially achieved tactical success, exploiting American inexperience to inflict heavy casualties and capture hundreds of prisoners. German after-action reports celebrated the victory as proof of American incompetence, reinforcing the propaganda narrative that Americans would always crack under German pressure. But the celebration proved premature. Within weeks, American forces regrouped with reinforcements, improved tactics, and crushing material superiority. The same German units that had achieved easy victories in February found themselves retreating by May, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of American artillery and air support. What disturbed German commanders about the Americans was not their cowardice, but their adaptability. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which relied on rigid doctrine and Prussian military tradition, the Americans approached warfare with industrial pragmatism, treating combat as a problem to be solved through superior logistics, overwhelming firepower, and relentless improvisation. They learned from defeats with unsettling speed. They promoted junior officers based on merit rather than social class. They integrated equipment innovations into doctrine within weeks rather than months. Most troubling of all, American soldiers displayed morale that seemed independent of ideology, a cheerful competence that suggested they were motivated by something more durable than propaganda slogans or fear of their own officers. By the time Hans Becker surrendered in the Ardennes, the gap between Nazi propaganda and battlefield reality had become impossible to ignore. The German army that stumbled out of the frozen forests in January 1945 had lost more than a military campaign. It had lost faith in the promises that had sustained it through years of increasingly desperate combat. The soldiers who raised their hands in surrender had watched the Luftwaffe disappear from the skies. They had endured American artillery barrages that seemed to have no end, supplied by an industrial base that operated beyond their comprehension. They had gone days without food while rumors spread about American soldiers discarding ration cans they found unpalatable. And now, as they became prisoners, they faced the ultimate test of everything they had been taught. Would the Americans prove as brutal as the propaganda claimed? Or had that been another lie in a war constructed from lies? The moment of surrender carried its own strange terror. Hans Becker had watched SS officers execute Soviet prisoners in Poland, had heard stories about partisan reprisals in Yugoslavia, had absorbed years of propaganda emphasizing that modern war was total war, that mercy was weakness, that enemies must be destroyed root and branch. As American soldiers approached his position, he braced for violence, for rage, for the righteous fury of men whose country he had helped attack. Instead, the first American who reached him was a young sergeant from Wisconsin named Robert Mueller, who looked exhausted and cold and utterly uninterested in vengeance. Mueller gestured for Hans to empty his pockets, conducted a perfunctory search for hidden weapons, then handed him off to another soldier who led him toward a collection point where dozens of other German prisoners huddled in the snow. What happened next shattered Hans's ideological framework more effectively than any artillery barrage. The American soldiers gave him a chocolate bar, not as a reward, not as a gesture of contempt, but casually, almost automatically, the way one human being shares food with another human being who is clearly starving. The chocolate was American military issue, a dense brown rectangle stamped with English words Hans could not read, and it tasted like nothing he had experienced in 4 years of war. It was sweet and rich and abundant, a tiny symbol of an industrial economy that could afford to give its soldiers chocolate while Germany's civilians ate turnips. Hans stood in the snow holding this chocolate bar and felt the first cracks appear in everything he had been taught to believe. The treatment of prisoners of war represents one of the most profound moral divides of the Second World War, revealing fundamental differences in how competing ideologies understood human dignity and the laws of war. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established international standards for prisoner treatment, requiring that captives be provided adequate food, shelter, and medical care, protected from violence and public humiliation, and allowed to send correspondence to their families. The United States, having ratified these conventions, approached prisoner handling as both a legal obligation and a strategic opportunity. American military doctrine recognized that humane treatment of prisoners served multiple purposes. It encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. It provided intelligence through interrogation of cooperative captives, and it demonstrated to the world that American democracy produced military forces, capable of moral restraint even in the extremity of combat. The contrast with German prisoner policies revealed the bankruptcy of Nazi ideology when confronted with the practical requirements of modern warfare. On the Eastern Front, where Hitler had declared a war of racial annihilation, German forces treated Soviet prisoners with systematic brutality that violated every principle of international law. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by German forces, an estimated 3.3 million died in captivity from starvation, disease, exposure, and outright execution. This was not accidental neglect, but deliberate policy, rooted in Nazi racial theory that classified Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans unworthy of the protections afforded to prisoners from Western nations. The Wehrmacht participated in these atrocities alongside the SS, distributing starvation rations, housing prisoners in open-air pens during Russian winters, and using captives as slave labor until they collapsed from exhaustion. But even on the Western Front, where Germany nominally observed Geneva Convention protocols for British and American prisoners, the treatment varied wildly depending on unit, location, and circumstance. British and American POWs generally received better treatment than Soviet prisoners, protected by the threat of reciprocal retaliation against German prisoners held by Western allies. Yet thousands of Western Allied prisoners still died from malnutrition, disease, and forced labor in German camps, particularly in the war's final months as the Reich's infrastructure collapsed. The most notorious incident occurred during the Battle of the Bulge itself, when SS troops under Joachim Peiper massacred 84 American prisoners at Malmedy on December 17, 1944, machine-gunning unarmed men in a snowy field in violation of every military convention. The Malmedy massacre spread rapidly through American units, hardening attitudes toward SS troops while paradoxically reinforcing American determination to maintain discipline and proper prisoner handling. What German prisoners encountered in American captivity was a system designed to balance security, intelligence gathering, and humane treatment in ways that seemed incomprehensible to men raised in the totalitarian efficiency of the Third Reich. Upon capture, German soldiers underwent initial processing at battalion or regimental collection points, where American MPs conducted searches, provided medical screening, and began segregating prisoners by rank and unit for intelligence purposes. The initial processing emphasized speed and security, but even in these first hours, German prisoners noticed details that contradicted their propaganda training. American soldiers shared cigarettes with prisoners who had been trying to kill them hours before. Medics treated wounded Germans with the same urgency they treated wounded Americans, distributing morphine and sulfa powder without regard to nationality. The food provided at collection points, while basic, was more substantial than what many German soldiers had eaten in weeks. Hans Becker spent his first night as a prisoner in a hastily erected tent camp behind American lines, surrounded by several hundred other captured Wehrmacht soldiers. The camp lacked proper heating, and the men huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. But they were given wool blankets, American military issue, thick and clean-smelling, and the American guards distributed hot coffee at regular intervals throughout the night. Coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute German soldiers had been drinking for 2 years. Hans wrapped his hands around the metal cup and felt the warmth seep into his frozen fingers. And he could not reconcile this simple kindness with the propaganda that had described Americans as ruthless materialists incapable of genuine human feeling. The cognitive dissonance intensified as prisoners were transported from frontline collection points to more permanent facilities behind the lines. German prisoners rode in American trucks that seemed impossibly well maintained, vehicles with functioning heaters and shock absorbers, driven by soldiers who appeared well-fed and adequately rested despite the same winter conditions that had reduced German forces to shambling exhaustion. The contrast was not subtle. German military logistics had been deteriorating since 1943. As Allied bombing destroyed fuel depots and Soviet advances consumed irreplaceable tank formations. By 1945, Wehrmacht soldiers routinely walked distances that should have been covered by motorized transport, while horses pulled artillery pieces designed for mechanized warfare. Seeing American logistics function smoothly, almost casually, drove home the material disparity between the two war machines in ways that statistics could never convey. The journey to rear-area prisoner camps took German soldiers through liberated French and Belgian towns where they witnessed civilians who appeared adequately fed and clothed, a stark contrast to the desperation visible across occupied Europe. In Germany itself, civilians faced severe rationing, and every family knew someone who had died from Allied bombing or at the front. In occupied territories, Nazi requisitions had stripped local populations down to near-starvation levels, concentrating resources to fuel the Wehrmacht's dwindling strength. Yet here, in towns the Germans themselves had occupied months earlier, people moved with a normalcy that suggested the American supply system was sufficient not just for its own forces, but for the civilian populations under its protection. This abundance created profound psychological pressure on German prisoners, who had been taught that Germany's war was defensive, necessary, a struggle for survival against enemies determined to annihilate the German people. If the enemy was so prosperous, so capable of feeding both soldiers and civilians, then what explained Germany's desperate condition? Processing at permanent POW camps completed the demolition of Wehrmacht propaganda's credibility. American prisoner facilities, while hardly luxurious, operated according to Geneva Convention standards with a bureaucratic thoroughness that baffled men from a military culture that prized improvisation and personal authority. German prisoners were photographed, fingerprinted, and issued identification cards. They received medical examinations more thorough than anything most had experienced in Wehrmacht service, where overworked field doctors often treated soldiers with little more than bandages and hope. Dentists extracted rotted teeth. Physicians treated infections that had been ignored for months. Men who had not bathed properly since leaving Germany were given access to hot showers and delousing stations, emerging clean for the first time in months. These were not privileges earned through cooperation, but standard procedures applied to all prisoners regardless of rank or attitude, reflecting an institutional commitment to basic human dignity that contradicted everything Nazi ideology taught about American moral weakness. The food provided in American POW camps became perhaps the most potent symbol of the gap between propaganda and reality. Geneva Convention standards required that prisoners receive rations equivalent to the captor nation's own garrison troops, and American camps generally met this requirement despite the logistical challenges of housing tens of thousands of prisoners. German prisoners received 3 meals daily, with caloric content that exceeded what Wehrmacht soldiers had eaten in the field, and far exceeded what German civilians currently received under increasingly severe rationing. Breakfast typically included coffee, bread, butter, or margarine, and sometimes eggs or cereal. Lunch and dinner featured meat, potatoes or rice, vegetables and bread, portions that seemed impossibly generous to men who had been eating frozen turnips and black bread. The quality varied by camp and circumstance, and many prisoners initially complained that American food lacked proper seasoning or was too sweet. But the sheer quantity made such complaints seem petty even to those voicing them. Hans Becker remembered his first proper meal in American captivity with the clarity of religious revelation. It was served in a mess hall at a camp in northern France, a long wooden structure with electric lights that banished the winter darkness. American soldiers ladled stew from metal containers, beef stew with potatoes and carrots and gravy, steam rising from the plates in the cold air. Hans sat at a wooden table with other prisoners, men from his regiment and men from units he had never heard of, all of them staring at their plates with expressions mixing disbelief and shame. The stew was hot and filling, and Hans ate until his stomach hurt, until he felt almost sick from eating more in one meal than he had eaten in the previous week. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, their faces reflecting the same emotional turmoil. This was the enemy who was supposed to be weak and degenerate. This was the nation Germany was supposedly defending civilization against. Yet Germany was starving while America fed even its prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. The question hung unspoken in the cold air of that mess hall, visible in every prisoner's eyes. How could the propaganda have been so utterly wrong? The answer, German prisoners discovered, was that the propaganda had not merely been wrong, but had systematically inverted reality, projecting onto America the very weaknesses that plagued the Third Reich. The Nazi regime had built its ideological foundation on claims of racial superiority and martial excellence, convinced that German discipline and fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. This conviction blinded Nazi leadership to the fundamental transformation in warfare wrought by industrial mass production, where victory increasingly depended not on individual heroism, but on the capacity to manufacture, transport, and deploy overwhelming quantities of standardized equipment. The United States had embraced this industrial approach to warfare with systematic thoroughness, building a military machine that reflected American cultural strengths in organization, innovation, and material abundance. American industrial mobilization for World War II represents one of history's most remarkable economic transformations, converting a peacetime economy still recovering from the Great Depression into an arsenal that supplied not only American forces but Allied armies across multiple theaters. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 17 million rifles, and 12,000 ships, figures that strained comprehension even among Allied planners who witnessed the buildup firsthand. This production occurred while simultaneously feeding American civilians, supplying Lend-Lease equipment to Britain and the Soviet Union, and maintaining a standard of living that, while reduced by wartime rationing, remained far above what civilians in combatant nations experienced. The automobile factories of Detroit converted to tank production. The aircraft plants of Seattle and Los Angeles operated around the clock. Shipyards on both coasts launched, vessels using prefabrication techniques that reduced construction time from years to months to weeks. What made American production so devastating to German strategic planning was not merely quantity, but the systematic efficiency that allowed rapid innovation and continuous improvement. Unlike German industry, which produced multiple variants of similar equipment and struggled with part standardization, American manufacturers embraced interchangeable components and assembly line techniques that simplified maintenance and training. American soldiers could repair equipment using standardized toolkits and field manuals, while German mechanics often required specialized tools and extensive training for each vehicle type. This difference multiplied across every category of military hardware, creating compounding advantages in the field. An American tank that broke down could often be repaired within hours using parts from other damaged vehicles, while a German Panther tank might sit disabled for weeks waiting for precision-manufactured components produced in factories targeted by Allied bombing. German prisoners saw the results of this industrial system in every aspect of American military operations. The trucks that transported them were sturdy and reliable, manufactured by the tens of thousands with interchangeable parts. The uniforms worn by their guards were well-made and properly fitted, produced by textile plants that could adjust output rapidly based on demand. Even small details revealed systematic efficiency. The flashlights carried by American guards used standardized batteries. The rifles carried by American soldiers fired ammunition that never seemed in short supply. The cigarettes American soldiers shared with prisoners came from massive production runs that treated tobacco as a necessary morale item rather than a scarce luxury. This abundance was not accidental but reflected deliberate choices about resource allocation made possible by an industrial base that operated on a scale German planners considered impossible. The contrast extended beyond material goods to encompass the human dimensions of military organization. American military culture, deriving from a civilian society that prized individual initiative and practical problem-solving, encouraged enlisted personnel to show creativity within the framework of mission orders. Non-commissioned officers wielded real authority, trained to make tactical decisions without constant oversight from commissioned ranks. This distributed decision-making allowed American units to adapt to unexpected circumstances with flexibility that seemed chaotic to German observers trained in more hierarchical traditions but proved devastatingly effective in fluid combat situations. When a bridge was destroyed, American engineers improvised replacements using local materials rather than waiting for orders. When supply lines were disrupted, American quartermasters requisitioned civilian resources and adapted distribution networks on the fly. The system lacked Prussian elegance but compensated through sheer pragmatic effectiveness. German prisoners struggled to process these observations because acknowledging American military effectiveness required confronting uncomfortable truths about their own nation's strategic situation. If America was as militarily competent as prisoners now witnessed firsthand, then Germany's defeat had been inevitable from the moment Hitler declared war. If American society was capable of producing such abundance while maintaining democratic institutions, then Nazi theories about the weakness of liberal democracy were simply wrong. If American soldiers treated prisoners humanely while German forces committed atrocities across Europe, then Germany's claim to represent civilization against barbarism was revealed as projection, the kind of psychological inversion that characterized so much of Nazi ideology. These realizations did not arrive fully formed, but accumulated gradually through hundreds of small observations, each one chipping away at the propaganda framework that had structured prisoners' understanding of the world. The interrogation process accelerated this ideological disintegration. By exposing prisoners to American intelligence, officers who approached questioning with psychological sophistication that belied propaganda, stereotypes about American crudeness. American interrogators understood that effective intelligence gathering required establishing rapport rather than relying on physical coercion or threats. They offered prisoners cigarettes and coffee, engaged them in seemingly casual conversations about life before the war, and demonstrated detailed knowledge of German unit structures that implied extensive intelligence networks prisoners had not known existed. This approach yielded far more useful information than the harsh interrogation methods favored by German military intelligence, which relied on intimidation and violence to extract confessions. Prisoners who might have resisted brutal questioning often found themselves volunteering information to American interrogators, who treated them as human beings rather than enemies. Hans Becker underwent interrogation 3 days after his capture. Sitting across a wooden table from an American captain who spoke fluent German and seemed more interested in discussing Hans's civilian background than his military service. The captain asked about Hans's family in Bavaria, his training with the Hitler Youth, his experiences on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. The questions seemed almost academic, lacking the aggressive intensity Hans associated with interrogation. The captain offered cigarettes and expressed sympathy for the hardships German soldiers endured during the winter offensive. Only later did Hans realize how much he had revealed. Not about tactical positions or unit strengths, but about morale, training, and the pervasive disillusionment spreading through Wehrmacht ranks as Germany's strategic position deteriorated. The interrogation was gentle, humane, and devastatingly effective, extracting information through kindness that threats could never have obtained. The intelligence gathered from prisoner interrogations provided American commanders with detailed assessments of German morale and combat effectiveness that shaped operational planning. Reports from the winter of 1945 documented widespread demoralization among German prisoners, particularly those captured during the Ardennes offensive. Prisoners described units composed increasingly of boys too young and men too old for frontline combat, equipped with obsolete weapons and supported by non-existent logistics. They described officers who no longer believed Germany could win, but continued fighting from habit, fear, or desperate hope that some miracle weapon would reverse the tide. They described the growing disconnect between Nazi propaganda claims and the reality visible to any soldier with eyes. The bombastic radio broadcasts promising imminent victory, even as American and Soviet forces squeezed Germany from both directions. This intelligence confirmed what Allied commanders suspected. German military power was a hollow shell, maintained only through draconian discipline and the Wehrmacht's professional competence, certain to collapse once pressure exceeded the breaking point. But intelligence value was merely one facet of how American prisoner policy served strategic ends. The more profound impact came from the way humane treatment converted German prisoners into informal ambassadors who undermined Nazi propaganda through personal testimony. Prisoners sent letters home through international Red Cross channels, describing their treatment in terms that contradicted everything German civilians had been told about American brutality. These letters, while censored for security information, could not be entirely suppressed without abandoning Geneva Convention provisions for prisoner correspondence. German families received mail from captured sons and brothers describing adequate food, medical care, and safe conditions, creating cognitive dissonance in a population being told by Nazi propaganda that Germany fought a defensive war against enemies determined to annihilate the German people. If Americans treated prisoners humanely, then perhaps other propaganda claims were equally false. This information warfare proved more effective than any leaflet campaign because it came from trusted sources, speaking from direct experience. German soldiers who might dismiss Allied propaganda leaflets as obvious deception could not so easily dismiss letters from their own comrades describing American treatment. The letters spread through informal networks, shared among families, and discussed in cautious whispers beyond the reach of Gestapo informers. They created subtle erosion in home front morale, planting doubts that accumulated into widespread disillusionment with the Nazi regime's increasingly hysterical proclamations. By treating prisoners humanely, American policy achieved strategic effects that complemented military operations, undermining German will to continue fighting more effectively than additional bombing raids or propaganda broadcasts. The humane treatment policy also reflected deeper values embedded in American political culture, deriving from constitutional traditions that emphasized individual rights and limited government power. Unlike totalitarian regimes that viewed individuals as expendable resources in service to state ideology, American democracy maintained, however imperfectly, a commitment to human dignity that extended even to enemies. This commitment was not universal or consistently applied. Japanese Americans faced internment, and African American soldiers confronted discrimination even while fighting for freedom abroad. Yet the principle that enemy soldiers deserved humane treatment once they surrendered reflected genuine American values, not merely calculated strategy. The chocolate bars and coffee, the medical care and adequate food. These represented not cynical manipulation, but authentic expressions of a political culture that recognized common humanity even across lines of national conflict. German prisoners gradually absorbed these values through daily interactions with American personnel that revealed the gap between Nazi caricatures and American reality. Guards who treated prisoners fairly, doctors who provided competent medical care, chaplains who respected prisoners' religious observances. All these contacts accumulated into a comprehensive education in how democratic societies functioned. Prisoners who had been taught that Americans were individualistic and selfish discovered soldiers who showed genuine concern for others' welfare. Prisoners who expected American racism to mirror Nazi racial theories found African American soldiers performing competently in integrated support roles, contradicting propaganda about racial hierarchies. Prisoners who assumed democratic chaos meant military incompetence witnessed systematic organization that suggested democracy could be efficient when properly structured. This transformation was neither immediate nor universal. Many prisoners clung to Nazi ideology through denial or wishful thinking, unable to abandon beliefs they had staked their identities upon. Hardcore SS members remained committed to Nazi racial theories regardless of contrary evidence, their fanaticism reinforced by complicity in atrocities that made ideological surrender psychologically impossible. Some Wehrmacht officers maintained aristocratic contempt for American culture, even while grudgingly acknowledging American military effectiveness. The transformation happened gradually, prisoner by prisoner, through accumulated experiences that made maintaining Nazi illusions increasingly difficult. It happened in mess halls where men ate better than they had eaten in years. It happened in medical tents where American doctors treated wounded prisoners with competence and care. It happened in recreation yards where prisoners could read American newspapers and see photographs documenting Nazi atrocities the regime had denied. It happened slowly, like ice melting, one frozen certainty at a time. The symbolic weight of food, that chocolate bar handed to Hans Becker in the moments after surrender, recurred throughout prisoner testimony as the detail that crystallized awareness of the vast gap between Nazi propaganda and lived reality. Food was not merely sustenance, but a statement about national priorities and industrial capacity, revealing what each society valued and how it allocated resources under wartime pressure. Germany had been on strict rationing since the war's beginning, with civilian rations declining steadily as the military consumed resources and Allied bombing destroyed transportation infrastructure. By 1945, German civilians survived on potatoes, turnips, and ersatz coffee, with meat and butter reserved for special occasions. The Nazi regime had promised that conquest would bring prosperity, that occupied territories would provision the Reich, that German discipline would overcome any material disadvantage. Instead, Germany starved while its armies retreated on all fronts, and the gap between promise and reality undermined regime legitimacy more effectively than any Allied propaganda campaign. American abundance, visible in every meal served to prisoners, demonstrated industrial capacity that made German victory impossible regardless of individual German courage or fighting skill. The United States had entered the war later than Germany, mobilized more slowly, yet by 1945 operated a war machine so vast that it could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. This was not achieved through superior racial characteristics or ideological commitment, but through systematic organization of industrial production, efficient logistics, and resource allocation that balanced military needs with civilian welfare. American farms produced food surpluses even while millions of men served in uniform. American factories manufactured military equipment while maintaining consumer goods production. American society absorbed wartime demands while preserving democratic institutions that allowed criticism of government policy. This holistic success contradicted every Nazi theory about the supposed weaknesses of liberal democracy. Prisoners recognized the implications even when they lacked vocabulary to articulate them clearly. Hans Becker, eating his third substantial meal in American captivity, understood viscerally what Wehrmacht briefings had obscured. Germany had challenged an opponent with resources beyond comprehension, and Germany's defeat was mathematical certainty regardless of individual battles won or lost. The realization brought not relief but profound grief. Mourning for friends who had died in service of an impossible cause. Anger at leaders who had sent Germany's youth to die pursuing fantasies of racial destiny. That chocolate bar, consumed in a frozen Belgian forest, became in Hans's memory the moment when propaganda dissolved and truth became unavoidable. He could not go back to believing the lies. He could not unknow what he now knew. The kindness of the American soldier who handed him that chocolate had destroyed the ideological framework that structured his understanding of himself and his world, and Hans would spend years reconstructing his identity from the fragments. The process of ideological deconstruction intensified as prisoners spent months in American captivity, exposed to information sources the Nazi regime had controlled or banned. American camps permitted prisoners to read newspapers, though censored for security information, that reported war progress with relative accuracy. Prisoners learned about German cities reduced to rubble by Allied strategic bombing, about Soviet advances that consumed the Wehrmacht's last reserves, about concentration camps liberated by American and British forces, revealing atrocities the Nazi regime had concealed. The reports about camps proved particularly difficult for many prisoners to process, challenging their self-conception as soldiers who had fought honorably for their nation rather than servants of a criminal regime. Many prisoners initially dismissed camp reports as Allied propaganda, unable to believe their government capable of systematic mass murder. Others recognized the truth immediately, having witnessed SS activities or heard rumors they had tried to ignore. The revelation split prisoners along ideological lines, between those who could abandon Nazi ideology and those who doubled down on denial American. Re-education programs in POW camps sought to accelerate ideological transformation by exposing prisoners to democratic political theory and evidence of Nazi criminality. Camps established libraries with books on American history and government, screened films about the war and American society, and organized discussion groups where prisoners could debate politics without fear of Gestapo retaliation. The programs walked a fine line between education and indoctrination, aiming to encourage democratic thinking without simply replacing Nazi propaganda with American propaganda. Results varied widely. Some prisoners embraced re-education as liberation from Nazi ideology, grateful for intellectual freedom they had never experienced. Others resented what they perceived as victor's justice, attempts to blame ordinary soldiers for crimes committed by regime leadership. The most effective elements proved to be those that simply exposed prisoners to information and allowed them to draw their own conclusions, trusting that human intelligence, when freed from totalitarian control, naturally gravitated toward truth. The transformation of German prisoners through American kindness and re-education programs provided lessons that extended far beyond World War II, offering insights into how democratic societies could wage ideological struggle without abandoning democratic values. The humane treatment policy cost money and resources that might have been directed toward frontline combat forces, yet it paid strategic dividends by undermining enemy morale and preparing for post-war reconstruction. By treating prisoners as human beings capable of change rather than irredeemable enemies, American policy created conditions where former Wehrmacht soldiers could return to Germany after the war and participate in building democratic institutions rather than nursing grievances that would poison post-war politics. This forward-thinking approach reflected American strategic vision that understood warfare as fundamentally political, aimed at achieving political ends that outlasted military victory. Hans Becker returned to Bavaria in 1946, repatriated after months in American captivity that transformed him more profoundly than 4 years of combat. He found his hometown devastated by bombing, his family living in a single room of their formerly comfortable house, his country occupied by Allied forces and divided into zones of control. The Germany he returned to bore little resemblance to the nation he had left as an enthusiastic Hitler Youth volunteer. The Third Reich had collapsed utterly. Its leaders dead or imprisoned, its ideology discredited, its crimes exposed in photographs and testimony that could not be denied. Yet Hans discovered that his time in American captivity had prepared him for this shattered landscape in ways he could not have anticipated. While other returning veterans clung to bitterness about Germany's defeat or retreated into denial about Nazi crimes, Hans carried memories of American soldiers who had treated him with decency when they could have shown cruelty. He remembered the chocolate bar, the hot coffee, the medical care, the meals that exceeded what German civilians now received from occupation authorities. These memories became a foundation for rebuilding, evidence that former enemies could show humanity, that ideological hatred was not inevitable, that Germany's future need not be poisoned by its past. Hans was not unique in this transformation. Across Germany, hundreds of thousands of repatriated prisoners carried similar experiences, having encountered American treatment that contradicted Nazi propaganda so thoroughly that it forced reconsideration of everything they had believed. These men became crucial agents in Germany's post-war democratization, living proof that Americans were not the monsters Nazi propaganda had portrayed. That democratic values could coexist with military strength. That material prosperity and human dignity were not incompatible with national greatness. Their testimony, shared in family conversations and community meetings, helped inoculate post-war German society against extremist movements that sought to blame defeat on betrayal rather than confront the criminal nature of the Nazi regime. The broader impact of American prisoner policy extended across multiple dimensions of post-war reconstruction. When American occupation authorities needed Germans who could be trusted to help rebuild democratic institutions, they often turned to former prisoners of war who had demonstrated ideological flexibility and willingness to work with occupation forces. These men became mayors of bombed-out towns, administrators of denazification programs, teachers in schools reopening after years of Nazi control. Their American captivity provided them with informal education in democratic processes that proved invaluable as West Germany constructed new political structures. They had seen democracy function, however imperfectly, in American camps and occupation zones. They understood that democratic governance required compromise and tolerance rather than the absolutism that characterized Nazi rule. They became bridges between German society and American occupation authorities, translating between cultures and mediating conflicts that might otherwise have poisoned Reconstruction efforts. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners illuminated the ideological gulf between Western democracies and totalitarian communism in ways that shaped Cold War dynamics for decades. Approximately 3 million German soldiers fell into Soviet captivity during the war, and their treatment reflected the brutality of the Eastern Front's racial war. Soviet prisoner camps, operating under Stalin's Gulag system, subjected German captives to forced labor, inadequate food, and harsh conditions that resulted in mortality rates approaching 30%. Of those who survived to be repatriated, most did not return until the mid-1950s, a decade after the war ended, and they brought stories of suffering that created visceral anti-communism across German society. The juxtaposition was stark. Americans fed prisoners well and repatriated them promptly. Soviets worked prisoners to death and held them for years beyond the war's end. This contrast became foundational to West German political culture, creating popular support for alignment with Western democracies rather than communist East Germany. The strategic wisdom of American prisoner policy became apparent as the Cold War transformed former enemies into allies. West Germany, reconstructed under American sponsorship and integrated into NATO by 1955, became a bulwark against Soviet expansion in Central Europe. Former Wehrmacht soldiers who had experienced American kindness in prisoner camps formed the core of the Bundeswehr, West Germany's new armed forces, creating continuity of military expertise while excluding the Nazi ideology that had poisoned the Wehrmacht. These soldiers understood from personal experience that Americans could be trusted as allies, that cooperation with Western democracies served German interests, that the ideological struggle against communism justified partnership with former enemies. The chocolate bars and coffee distributed to prisoners in 1945 paid strategic dividends for decades, building relationships that shaped European security architecture throughout the Cold War. Hans Becker never forgot the American sergeant who handed him that chocolate bar in the Belgian forest. In later years, after Germany's economic miracle transformed West Germany into Europe's most prosperous nation, after democratic institutions proved durable and successful, Hans would tell his children and grandchildren about that moment of surrender. He described the terror he felt as he raised his hands, convinced Americans would exact vengeance for German aggression. He described his shock when offered food instead of bullets, kindness instead of cruelty. He described how that simple gesture cracked the foundation of everything Nazi propaganda had taught him, forcing confrontation with truths he had been conditioned to deny. His children, growing up in democratic prosperity that would have seemed impossible in 1945, struggled to understand the power of that moment. They had never known hunger, never experienced the totalitarian control that shaped their father's youth, never faced the choice between ideological certainty and uncomfortable truth. But Hans persisted in telling the story because he understood its larger meaning. The chocolate bar was not merely food, but a symbol of the fundamental difference between societies that valued human dignity and regimes that treated people as expendable resources. It represented the power of small kindnesses to undermine great hatreds, the capacity of democratic values to survive even in warfare's extremity, the possibility that enemies could become allies when treated with respect rather than dehumanized through propaganda. The lessons extended beyond German prisoners to encompass broader questions about how democracies should wage ideological struggle without abandoning democratic principles. The 20th century presented liberal democracies with existential challenges from totalitarian movements that rejected fundamental assumptions about human rights and political freedom. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia constructed alternative visions of modernity that promised order, power, and belonging through submission to absolute authority and comprehensive ideology. These systems achieved genuine popular support, not merely through coercion, but by offering answers to anxieties about rapid social change, economic instability, and perceived cultural decline. Defeating them militarily proved insufficient. The ideas had to be discredited, alternatives demonstrated, populations convinced that democratic freedom was superior to totalitarian certainty. American treatment of German prisoners represented one element of this broader ideological competition, demonstrating through concrete actions rather than abstract rhetoric that democratic societies could be strong without being brutal, efficient without being totalitarian, victorious without being vengeful. This demonstration carried weight precisely because it occurred during war, when ideological principles face their severest tests. Any society can proclaim commitment to human rights during peacetime prosperity. Maintaining that commitment while fighting for survival against enemies who reject those principles entirely requires moral courage and strategic confidence. American prisoner policy reflected both, showing that democracy was not weakness, but strength rooted in values that could withstand warfare's pressures without corruption. The policy was not without critics, both contemporary and historical. Some American soldiers resented sharing scarce resources with enemy prisoners while their own forces endured hardship. Some officers questioned whether humane treatment encouraged German soldiers to surrender rather than fight, potentially prolonging the war. Some historians argue that American benevolence toward German prisoners contrasted uncomfortably with harsher treatment of Japanese prisoners in the Pacific Theater, revealing racial double standards that undermined claims about universal values. These criticisms deserve serious consideration, acknowledging that American policy was neither perfectly consistent nor entirely free from the prejudices that infected American society generally. Yet the fundamental achievement remains significant. American forces, drawn from a society that had been at peace for 2 decades before Pearl Harbor, mobilized for global war while maintaining institutional commitments to prisoner rights that derived from democratic values. This achievement was neither inevitable nor automatic. It required conscious policy choices by military leadership, training that emphasized Geneva Convention obligations, and enforcement mechanisms that punished violations. It required cultural assumptions about human dignity that survived even in combat's brutality, assumptions so deeply embedded in American political tradition that soldiers could extend basic decency to enemies without feeling they betrayed their own comrades. The transformation of Hans Becker, from Nazi true believer to democratic citizen, illustrated these principles' power at individual scale. He was not extraordinary. Millions of German soldiers underwent similar journeys, questioning ideology in prisoner camps and rebuilding lives in post-war wreckage. But his story captures the human dimension of ideological struggle that statistics and strategy papers cannot convey. He was 19 years old when he surrendered in that Belgian forest, his mind filled with propaganda and his body failing from hunger and cold. He was 20 when he returned to Germany, carrying memories of American kindness that had shattered his ideological certainty. He lived to see Germany reunified, the Berlin Wall fallen, democratic institutions consolidated across territories that had been divided by Cold War rivalry. And through all those years, he carried that chocolate bar in memory, a small gift that represented truths larger than any propaganda could contain. The epilogue to this story extends into the present, shaping how contemporary democracies understand the relationship between military power and political values. The question Hans Becker confronted in that prisoner camp, how could American soldiers show kindness to enemies who had tried to kill them, remains relevant in an era when democratic societies face challenges from authoritarian movements that reject liberal values. The answer his experience provided was not that democracies are pacifist or weak, but that democratic strength derives from values that transcend immediate military necessity, that treating even enemies with basic human dignity serves strategic purposes while expressing fundamental commitments about what makes societies worth defending. This understanding influenced American conduct in subsequent conflicts, though with mixed results that reflected the complexity of applying principles across vastly different contexts. In Korea, American forces maintained Geneva Convention standards for prisoner treatment, despite facing an enemy that routinely violated those standards. In Vietnam, the principle eroded under pressures of counterinsurgency. Warfare, where distinguishing combatants from civilians proved difficult and frustration mounted as military superiority failed to achieve political victory. The revelations about Abu Ghraib and other detention abuses during the War on Terror demonstrated that commitment to humane treatment requires constant vigilance and institutional enforcement, that wartime pressures always tempt abandonment of principles that seem to constrain operational effectiveness. Yet the World War II experience remained a reference point, an example of how humane prisoner treatment served both moral imperatives and strategic interests. Military ethicists and legal scholars continued to cite American prisoner policy in Europe as evidence that maintaining Geneva Convention standards was possible even in total war against ideologically hostile enemies. The policy's success in facilitating post-war reconciliation with Germany provided concrete demonstration that treating prisoners humanely helped build foundations for lasting peace rather than merely storing up grievances for future conflicts. These lessons shaped doctrine, training, and institutional culture in ways that influenced how American military forces approached prisoner operations in later conflicts, even when implementation fell short of ideals. The symbolic resonance of that chocolate bar, meanwhile, entered into broader cultural narratives about American identity and values. Veterans returning from Europe told stories about German prisoners who seemed shocked by American treatment. Encounters that reinforced American self-image as fundamentally decent people who fought when necessary but harbored no hatred for enemy populations. These stories became part of how Americans understood their role in World War II, the good war that seemed to validate American power and purpose in ways that later conflicts would complicate but never entirely erase. The narrative of American GIs sharing chocolate and cigarettes with former enemies became iconic, captured in photographs and memoirs that shaped popular memory of the war. Critics might argue this narrative glossed over complexities and contradictions, that it presented American benevolence too uncritically, that it ignored or minimized instances when American forces fell short of Geneva Convention standards. These criticisms have merit. The historical record contains examples of prisoner abuse, inadequate camp conditions, and racial discrimination that complicate simple stories about American virtue. Yet the criticism should not obscure the fundamental reality that American policy toward German prisoners represented a genuine commitment to humane treatment that distinguished American conduct from Nazi Germany's systematic brutality. The difference was real, observable, consequential. German prisoners who survived American captivity overwhelmingly testified to treatment that, while far from pleasant, respected their basic humanity in ways that contrasted sharply with German treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front. Hans Becker's transformation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, shaped post-war Europe in ways that extended far beyond individual conversions to democratic values. These former prisoners became agents of cultural transmission, carrying knowledge about American society back to Germany and sharing it through informal networks that official occupation authorities could not replicate. They knew Americans not as propaganda caricatures, but as real people they had encountered directly. They had seen American soldiers who were competent and caring, disciplined and decent, capable of terrible violence in combat, yet able to show mercy after victory. This knowledge immunized significant portions of German society against anti-American propaganda during the Cold War, creating reservoirs of goodwill that American diplomacy could draw upon when conflicts arose between allied partners. The economic dimension of American treatment also carried lasting significance. German prisoners who experienced American material abundance firsthand returned home with visceral understanding of the productivity gap between American capitalism and German wartime economy. They had eaten American food, worn American clothes, used American equipment, and seen American logistics function with efficiency that made German supply operations look amateurish. This experience created openness to American economic models during post-war Reconstruction, willingness to adopt market-oriented policies and integrate into American-led international economic institutions. The Marshall Plan's success in reviving Western European economies depended partly on populations willing to accept American assistance and advice, and former prisoners played crucial roles in building political support for integration with Western economic systems. The contrast with Soviet-occupied Eastern Germany illuminated these dynamics. East Germany received no Marshall Plan assistance, instead facing Soviet reparations demands that stripped remaining industrial capacity. Germans who returned from Soviet captivity brought stories of brutal treatment that created visceral anti-communism across the population. The result was two Germanys that diverged dramatically over subsequent decades, West Germany prospering under democratic capitalism while East Germany stagnated under communist dictatorship. Former prisoners who had experienced both American and Soviet treatment understood the stakes of this division more clearly than most, having seen in microcosm the systematic differences between democratic and totalitarian societies. Their testimony helped sustain West German morale during the difficult early years of division, when the country's future remained uncertain and Soviet power seemed threatening. Hans Becker witnessed this division from his home in Bavaria, firmly within the American occupation zone that became West Germany. He watched his country recover from devastation with speed that seemed miraculous, watched democratic institutions take root and flourish, watched former enemies become partners in building a European order that made future wars unthinkable. He watched German economic recovery surpass even optimistic projections, transforming Germany from defeated enemy to indispensable ally within a decade. And through it all, he carried memory of that chocolate bar as a reminder that the transformation had begun not with grand diplomatic initiatives, but with small acts of kindness that acknowledged common humanity even in wars. Aftermath. In his final years, Hans spoke often about the responsibility that came with this memory. He had survived when so many had died. He had been transformed when so many remained trapped in bitterness or denial. He had received kindness from enemies who owed him nothing but contempt. These experiences created obligations to remember truthfully, to witness honestly, to ensure that future generations understood how close Germany had come to complete moral collapse under Nazi rule and how American treatment of prisoners had helped create possibilities for different futures. He told his story to school groups studying World War II, to university researchers documenting prisoner experiences, to journalists exploring the roots of German-American friendship. He insisted on acknowledging German crimes even while describing American kindness, refusing to let memory of decent treatment obscure recognition of the criminal regime he had served. This unflinching honesty characterized the best of Germany's post-war reckoning with Nazi past, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths while building democratic future. Hans and thousands like him represented Germany's better angels, men who had been complicit in evil through service to the Wehrmacht, yet found the moral courage to acknowledge that complicity and work toward different values. Their transformation was not complete or perfect. They carried guilt and trauma that never fully healed, but they demonstrated that change was possible, that ideology could be questioned, that people raised in totalitarian systems could learn to think and act democratically when given opportunity and support. The American soldier who handed Hans that chocolate, Barr never knew the impact of his gesture. He was probably just following standard procedures, sharing rations as instructed, performing the routine tasks of prisoner processing without particular thought about ideological transformation or post-war reconstruction. Yet his simple act embodied principles larger than he realized, that enemies remain human, that victory creates responsibilities, that strength allows mercy, that kindness can be strategic without being cynical. These principles distinguished democratic societies from totalitarian alternatives, proving more durable than any propaganda because they reflected genuine values rather than imposed ideology. The chocolate bar became, in this sense, a symbol of everything that separated American democracy from Nazi totalitarianism. It represented abundance versus scarcity, generosity versus cruelty, individual dignity versus collective dehumanization, strategic vision versus tactical myopia, confidence versus insecurity, strength versus brutality. It was not a grand gesture or dramatic moment, but a small kindness extended at a moment of vulnerability. And precisely because it was small and human rather than grand and ideological, it carried power that propaganda could never match, the final truth that emerges from Hans Becker's story and the experiences of thousands like him is that ideological warfare is ultimately warfare about what it means to be human. Nazi Germany constructed a political religion around claims that humanity was divided into superior and inferior races, that history was racial struggle for survival, that mercy was weakness, and cruelty was strength. This ideology justified crimes of almost incomprehensible scale, from the systematic murder of 6 million Jews to the deliberate starvation of millions of Soviet prisoners, from the euthanasia of disabled Germans to the enslavement of entire populations across occupied Europe. It was ideology that denied common humanity, that treated vast categories of people as vermin to be exterminated or slaves to be exploited. American treatment of German prisoners represented the democratic alternative to this totalitarian vision, that all humans possess inherent dignity regardless of nationality or ideology, that even enemies retain rights that must be respected, that civilization is measured not by racial purity or military might, but by capacity to maintain ethical standards even under extreme pressure. This alternative was not merely rhetorical but operational, expressed through concrete policies that required real sacrifices of resources and security. It was not perfectly implemented or universally applied, but it represented genuine commitment to values that transcended immediate military necessity. The power of this alternative became visible in its effects on those who encountered it. Hans Becker's transformation from Nazi true believer to democratic citizen did not result from persuasive arguments or clever propaganda, but from experiences that contradicted his ideological training so thoroughly that maintaining that ideology became psychologically impossible. He had been taught that Americans were racial mongrels and cultural degenerates, yet he encountered American soldiers who showed more discipline and humanity than his own officers. He had been promised that German will would overcome American materialism, yet he saw American industrial capacity that rendered German sacrifice meaningless. He had believed Nazi propaganda about Jewish control of American government, yet he met American soldiers of every ethnicity working together with effectiveness. That suggested Nazi racial theories were nonsense. These experiences accumulated into comprehensive demolition of Nazi ideology that no counterargument could have achieved. Hans could not maintain belief in racial hierarchies when treated humanely by soldiers from diverse backgrounds. He could not believe American democracy was weak when witnessing its military efficiency. He could not credit propaganda about Jewish conspiracies when seeing how American society actually functioned. The gap between what he had been taught and what he experienced became impossible to bridge through rationalization or denial, forcing confrontation with the reality that everything he believed had been systematically wrong. This confrontation was painful, even traumatic. Hans had invested his identity in Nazi ideology, had risked his life for beliefs he now recognized as lies, had been complicit in crimes committed in service of those beliefs. Acknowledging the truth required accepting responsibility for actions taken under false premises, mourning friends who died for nothing, confronting the shame of having served evil while believing it was good. Many former soldiers never completed this emotional journey, remaining trapped in bitterness or denial that poisoned their remaining years. But those like Hans, who found the courage to see clearly, became crucial agents of post-war transformation, living demonstrations that redemption was possible, that Germans could rebuild as democratic citizens rather than remaining trapped in fascist past. The American kindness that initiated this transformation was not soft or sentimental but hard and practical, rooted in strategic calculation that humane treatment served military and political objectives. Yet it was also genuine kindness, reflecting values embedded in American political culture that recognized common humanity even across lines of national conflict. This combination of strategic pragmatism and genuine decency proved devastatingly effective against Nazi ideology, which could inspire sacrifice, but could not sustain itself when confronted with alternatives that offered both material abundance and moral dignity. The chocolate bar that Hans Becker received on that frozen day in January 1945 represented all of this in miniature: American abundance, strategic vision, democratic values, simple human kindness. It was a small thing, easily overlooked in the vast machinery of total war. Yet it carried meaning that transcended its material insignificance, representing truths about human dignity and democratic values that would shape European politics for generations. That chocolate bar destroyed Nazi propaganda more effectively than any bombing raid or military victory, not through force but through the simple power of experienced reality contradicting ideological fantasy. And so Hans Becker lived out his years in democratic Germany, carrying memory of that moment when an American soldier offered chocolate to a captured enemy and thereby initiated a transformation that would ripple across decades. He watched Germany rebuilt, reunified, integrated into democratic Europe. He saw former enemies become trusted allies, watched institutions he had fought against prove their worth through sustained success. And always he remembered that chocolate bar, symbol of the moment when kindness destroyed hatred and truth demolished propaganda, when a small gesture revealed vast differences between societies that honor human dignity and regimes that deny it. The lesson endures. That ideological warfare is won not merely through military victory but through demonstrated alternatives. That democracy's strength lies not in matching totalitarian brutality, but in maintaining values that respect human dignity. That kindness can be strategic without being cynical. That small gestures carry power beyond their immediate scale. These truths, learned by German prisoners in American camps and carried home to rebuild German society, remain relevant whenever democracies confront authoritarian alternatives. They remind us that the struggle between freedom and tyranny is ultimately struggle about what it means to be human, and that the outcome depends not just on military might, but on the capacity to embody values worth fighting for. Hans Becker died in 1998. Having lived long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and Germany reunified under democratic government. His final words to his family returned to that January morning in the Belgian forest, to the terror and hope of surrender, to the chocolate bar that changed everything. He had spent 53 years trying to honor the unexpected mercy shown by an anonymous American soldier, trying to build a life worthy of the second chance that mercy had provided. His transformation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of former enemies, helped build the democratic Germany that emerged from fascism's ashes, proving that kindness can indeed destroy propaganda when it embodies truths that propaganda can only deny. The American soldier who gave him that chocolate never knew any of this. He returned home after the war, resumed civilian life, and probably never thought again about one frightened German prisoner among thousands he processed. Yet his simple act, repeated by thousands of American soldiers across European battlefields, helped win the peace as surely as military operations won the war. It demonstrated that American democracy was not merely militarily powerful, but morally superior, not through proclamations but through actions, not through propaganda, but through practiced values. And in so doing, it achieved what no amount of force alone could accomplish. It transformed enemies into allies and helped build a world where the ideological struggle Hans Becker had fought for was revealed as the criminal delusion it had always been. That chocolate bar, pressed into frozen hands by a tired soldier following his training and his conscience, proved mightier than all of Goebbels' propaganda, more transformative than any Wehrmacht victory, more lasting than any totalitarian monument. It was a small thing that revealed great truths, that democracy's strength flows from its values, that kindness can be strategic, that treating enemies with dignity serves both moral imperatives and national interests. that the struggle for human freedom is won not just through force of arms, but through demonstrated commitment to the dignity of all human beings, even those who fight against us. This is the story of how German soldiers discovered that American kindness destroyed Nazi propaganda more thoroughly than any military defeat. It is the story of Hans Becker and hundreds of thousands like him, men who surrendered expecting vengeance but received mercy, who encountered abundance where they expected deprivation, who found humanity where ideology had promised monsters. It is a story about the power of values to transcend immediate circumstances, about the strategic wisdom of maintaining principles under pressure, about the possibility of transformation when truth confronts ideology. And it is a story that reminds us, in times when democracy faces new challenges from authoritarian alternatives, that the contest between freedom and tyranny is decided not merely by military power, but by the capacity to embody values that honor human dignity and offer genuine alternatives to ideological hatred. The chocolate bar endures in memory as symbol of these truths. Small gift that revealed vast differences between democratic and totalitarian societies. Kindness that destroyed propaganda through the simple power of lived experience, contradicting ideological fantasy. It reminds us that in the end, the struggle for human freedom is won not just through force, but through demonstrated commitment to values worth defending. That democracy's true strength lies not in matching totalitarian brutality, but in maintaining principles that recognize common humanity even in warfare's extremity. That the most powerful weapons against totalitarian ideology are not bombs or bullets, but simple acts of decency that embody truths propaganda can never overcome.